Welcome to Disunion, the Government Union Report, the podcast where we delve into the ever-evolving landscape of public sector labor policy and law. Jordan Teuscher is a representative to the Utah House of Representatives, representing District 44 within Salt Lake County. He was first elected to the Utah House in 2020 and has been a rising star there. In 2023, he was appointed to the House leadership team and now serves as the House Rules Chair, among other leadership positions. He received his undergraduate degree and law degree from BYU, worked for a traditional law firm for a few years, and now serves as a transactional lawyer for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Representative Teuscher, thanks for joining me. So I invited Representative Teuscher to come on the program after following the story of a bill he introduced. It was numbered HB 267 and called Public Sector Labor Union Amendments, kind of unassuming. I watched it go from the House Business, Labor, and Commerce Committee to the floor, and then to the Senate, and then to the governor, who signed it. And it didn't change one bit. There's a longer story to that, which I definitely want to cover. But it's a remarkable piece of legislation that empowers state and local government employees to work directly with their employers and to freely decide for themselves whether or not to be members of a union. But before we get to the meat of the bill, Representative Teuscher, I have to ask, how did this issue become such a priority for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's an issue that I've been working on really for the last 3 years here in the House. And it stems, if I go all the way back, my second term or my second year in the legislature, I was working on a curriculum transparency bill. And at that time, it was sort of the height of coming out of the pandemic and hearing some of the things that were going on in classrooms and the CRT issues that were going on. And the legislature had recently decided to pass a resolution kind of directing schools away from that. And as I dug into the issue, trying to figure out, okay, what really is going on here? How can we solve it? I thought, what we need is to give more transparency of what's going on in the classroom to parents, because most teachers are really doing a great job. But if they knew what was going on and if they saw something that was happening that would be a problem beforehand, then they could raise it to the teacher and the problem hadn't been, no harm had happened at that point. So I pushed this curriculum transparency bill that essentially would have required a syllabus to be posted and for teachers to say, here's the curriculum that we're going to cover, here's the text we're going to bring into the classroom, that sort of thing. And it blew up in the state. I had teachers just, protesting at the Capitol, thousands of emails that were sent. And as I dug in, because it seemed like a pretty reasonable policy call, what was really happening was our labor group from education was sending out complete lies about what the bill was doing. And so much that at some point I just had to pause on the bill because the bill had been tainted so much misinformation and untruths that were said about it from the different labor organizations that I had to start over. And that really kind of started me down this path to dive in to say, well, where's this power coming from? Why are they trying to rile up teachers and not calm them down? We hear this mantra from teachers all the time that, the state legislature doesn't care about us or they're attacking us. And I'm like, who's telling them that? Because that's not true. That's not what I hear from my colleagues up here. And as I dove into it, it really was coming from the unions, and the unions that were much more focused in trying to preserve their own power, trying to preserve their influence, than actually trying to advocate for teachers out in the field. And so it started after that bill. I had a conversation with someone who now actually serves as a state officer here, but said that when he was serving the state legislature, that he had tried to solve a problem where the payroll deductions for unions were being collected by the government. And he said, that's not right. We shouldn't be doing that. And that's when I said, all right, I'm going to take that issue on. And that started this 3-year journey that brought us to HB 267.
Very interesting. So some of that's surprising, at least from an outsider's perspective. The Commonwealth Foundation is based in Pennsylvania. We're largely focused on Pennsylvania policy. In Pennsylvania, we have a robust set of statutes that go by the name of the Public Employee Relations Act. It's very similar to laws you see across the country. Utah doesn't have anything like that. So from our perspective, as outsiders, Utah doesn't have a public sector labor problem. And yet here's the union, getting involved in not just labor issues, but in educational issues as well. How did unions come to be such a powerful political force in Utah?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it's fair to say that we don't really have a big public labor union issue in the state of Utah. We've been a right to work state, for over 60 years. For most public employees in the state, the unions serve as more of an employee association that, listens to concerns, might do a little bit of advocacy, but is more around, planning parties and, celebrating people's birthdays and that sort of thing than really hardcore, negotiations or strikes or anything like that. But, and so I think that's important to know in kind of the context and background to moving forward the ultimate ban on collective bargaining that we had in HB 267. Because if you look at collective bargaining, it's really outside of teacher unions. The only other collective bargaining that's happening in the state was in one city with police and fire. Every other public employee in the state, they weren't collective bargaining at all. And not even every education association was collectively bargaining. So I don't know exactly how the teachers union seemed to have such a hold over what was happening in Utah. I will say that the Utah's a little bit unique in the delicate balance that we have between students and teachers because we have the number one birth rate in the country. We have the most kids. That tends to lead to higher class sizes. Though we spend the most as a percentage of our budget on public education, we typically rank, last or second to last in per pupil spending. And that's something that's brought up a lot and people are concerned about. And so I think over time, teachers have found value in having the union out there, and the union's kind of found that if we can message a way that we're fighting for teachers and we're getting more money and this is a big problem, that it caused more teachers to be members of the union.
Okay, makes sense. So tell me about what the bill does to correct this imbalance.
Yeah, so like I said, when I started this bill, it really was around paycheck protection. Yeah, should the government really be the dues collector for unions? And when we ran the bill, I introduced the bill in the 2023 general session. At that point, my plan was let's just throw it out there. Let's get some reaction. I'll work in the interim. We have one of the shortest legislative sessions in the country, 45 straight calendar days. We start the day after Martin Luther King Day and the first week of March. And so there's not a lot of time for negotiation during the session. Most of negotiating happens outside of the session. So I introduced the bill at the end of the session, had a chance to work on it in the interim, met with all the different labor groups and organizations to try to get their input, incorporated a lot of that, and came forward in the 2024 general session with as I dug into it, saw that not only was the paycheck protection really an issue, but collective bargaining was a lot of the problem that I saw. Because with collective bargaining, what you found is you have a teachers union or, in Salt Lake City, the firefighter police union that sits across the table from the school district or from the city and negotiates demands. And as I went around and talked to different teachers in the state, in a lot of cases, they weren't members of the union and they didn't have a voice in any of that negotiation that was going on. And so as I looked into it, I thought, it makes sense that at least if they're going to do that collective bargaining, they should have, 50% or more membership before they could engage in something like that. And so we threw that into the bill in 2024. That obviously caused, a lot of consternation from the labor unions. And as you probably read in our Wall Street Journal, at that point, the journal article that was published last week, at that point, we had the votes to pass through the recertification process that we wanted, the 50% plus one that you would have to have for collective bargaining. Also, a ban on the paycheck dues deductions. But it was kind of a situation that we were trying to fight for some changes in our Constitution and the way that we fund public education. The unions were at the table negotiating in good faith, and we felt like, all right, let's punt this. Let's continue to work on the issue. Let's get their feedback and move forward. And unfortunately, what we found is as soon as we did that, put pause on this, ended our general session, the unions turned against us. they sued the state. They promised that they would be neutral on this. They went opposed to it. And ultimately, the Supreme Court took the question off the ballot, and we weren't able to amend the Constitution. So as I worked in it this last interim in trying to move forward and really, again, diving into that collective bargaining issue, we just said, we're not going to do collective bargaining in the state anymore. That just doesn't fit Utah's culture. There's no reason for it. And it's counterproductive because you have so many teachers or firefighters, police officers that just don't have a voice in their own employment negotiations. And so that's what we introduced in the bill and had started to move forward with and ultimately was passed. In addition to some other protections, we added a professional liability insurance for teachers so that they could come to the state to get insurance rather than going through the unions for that. That's something we heard a lot from teachers that they wanted, that the only reason that they were members of the union was because of the insurance protections.
I saw that, yeah.
One other last thing that we had in the bill was we in our state retirement system, for whatever reason, the union employees, so these are not teachers or firefighters that happen to also be members of the union, but only work for the union, were able to take a state retirement benefit. And so we stopped that practice. We kicked them off of the state retirement board, said it's not the union representatives that should be representing teachers, it's the teachers themselves or the firefighters themselves or the police officers themselves. And that's pretty much what the bill covers.
Yeah, the free liability, free professional liability insurance kind of was tacked on. It looked like at the end. I don't know if that's how conceptually it was thought about, but what a wonderful way to show teachers that you're not against them, you're for them, that this is something that would liberate them from having to join a union rather than to penalize them for union membership or something like that. So this is something that Florida did some years ago. I'm not sure that any other state has gone into that territory, Representative Teuscher. But I think at the very least a very good messaging device. But most teachers that I talk to, this is why they join the union. So why not help them with that at a relatively cheap cost for the state? I mean, I don't know how much it's going to cost to procure this kind of thing by competitive bidding, but
we found it would cost about $150 a year per teacher. The average union due is about $80 a month.
Right.
So for less than the cost of 2 months of joining the union, you get the full coverage. Now, what the state did, we debated back and forth. Do we just cover it 100%? And one of the things we found is there are a lot of protections already for teachers. We already were providing insurance. Anything in the scope of their practice, if they were teaching, the state would come in and defend them. But they still felt like they needed this extra benefit and liability. We were afraid if we covered everything, it would just get lost. And then the unions would still say, well, you need our coverage. So the state is going to cover half of the cost.
Half of it, okay.
$75 of that $150. So again, for less than the cost of 1 month of union membership, they can get better coverage through the state than they would get through the union.
Makes sense. And that's, I'll tell you, in all my years of practice representing employees, including many, many teachers, I've never seen one of them have to access this insurance product. And yet, in the event that they do have to access it, at that point, it becomes very valuable to them. So it makes sense that they would find some value there. I also saw a limit. So there's a paycheck protection element in this bill. But I also saw something in the way of prohibiting unions from charging more than a certain percentage of a employee's paycheck in dues. Is that also something that's part of the bill?
It is. It actually was already in state law. So you probably just saw it kind of moving down in a different section. I think it's 3%. So you can't have more than 3% of their paycheck go towards union dues. But what we did do, rather than a straight out ban on the paycheck dues deduction, because what we found last year as we introduced it, there were some teachers that were like, well, I really appreciate that convenience. Why are you taking something away from me? And so what we set up in the bill is, rather than ban it outright, we said, well, if you're going to ask the government to be your dues collector, then there's certain information that you should be willing to share to your members and to the Department of Labor in the state as well. And that includes how much money, where your money's going, essentially, how much of it's going to political purposes. Now, the dues themselves can't go to political purposes under state law, but how much are they raising from other areas that are going to political purposes? How many members do you have? That seems to be this ongoing debate that we go, from the best we can tell in the state of Utah, about a third of teachers are members of the union, but the Education Association refuses to share any of those numbers. So we're saying, well, if you want us to be your dues collector, then you need to share that information with us. We feel like most of the unions are going to move away from the dues collection on their own, just because they don't want to be transparent like that. But we would allow for the dues deductions if they will give that level of transparency.
Well, I'll tell you why they don't want to show it. So one of the more recent states, I mentioned Florida already, one of the more recent states to enact something like this was Florida. And what Florida has discovered through some of the transparency is that many of the unions that say they're representing public employees, including teachers, actually have membership rates way below 50%, sometimes down 13, 10, 8%. And in my view, it would be an illegal negotiation if the state were to continue to talk with a union that doesn't actually represent members. It would certainly be prohibited under federal law. So that's really all very fascinating. I saw there was one other element in the bill that has been a feature of some movements in federal law, but I haven't seen many states move in this direction. There was a ban on I guess I would call it government support for union activities, including giving employees paid leave to participate in union activities, or for unions to use government property for union activities. What was the motivation behind that kind of a prohibition?
Yeah, one of the things we wanted to look at is just setting up proper guardrails between these private labor unions and public buildings, public access, public information, data, all of that. I think most people believe that we shouldn't be using government funds or resources to prop up private labor unions, that there should be a clear separation. And so we tried to put in what we felt like were really common sense protections. You can't pay for release time, right? If the union wants to pay you to go do union work, that's great. Government shouldn't be paying for that. The same thing about government buildings. We're not saying that they can't use a government building, but you have to treat them the same as any other organization. If you're going to allow the Kiwanis Club or the Chamber of Commerce or the Boy Scouts of America the ability to use a building, then you should allow the labor union to use a building. If you don't, then you shouldn't allow the labor union to do it. If you charge them $50 an hour, you should charge the labor union $50 an hour, but just treat them the same as any other group. And then on the data side, it's something that hasn't got a lot of press, but that's one of the things that we found, is that the school districts were just kind of handing everything over to the labor unions, email addresses, phone numbers, that sort of thing. And we said, no, that is protected data, that's government data, that shouldn't be shared. They can go and collect their own data.
Yeah, that's a totally common sense measure in states where unions have really dominated, places like California and Oregon, New York, Connecticut. Unions have long gotten those kinds of that kind of data through collective bargaining, but because normal everyday people see it as violative of privacy, the unions have had to get state law enacted in order to continue to get that information. I think it makes them look really bad. It also makes them look responsible when there's a data breach, which there have been many instances of it. Unions aren't great record keepers. I've represented some employees and unions who keep their servers in closets, and they're not sophisticated systems. So hackers have gotten in and taken some of that stuff. People don't realize that in states like Utah and even very employee friendly states, that some employers are just giving it over when asked. And so it probably took a measure like this to ensure safety for employees along these lines. Well, you did write an article about an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal that was published. You mentioned this. It's called Republicans Need to Learn Government Unions Can't Be Trusted. Given some of the federal laws that have advanced by Republicans in Congress, I thought this was really fascinating. I'd asked you to join before you wrote this article, but I saw this and I thought, well, we've got to talk about that. Your own story and this bill's evolution, I I think is one reason why you wrote this, but it looks like these federal efforts and some of the Republicans' friendliness to unions was also a big motivator. Can you kind of tell me what you meant by? I know you probably didn't write the headline. Wall Street Journal may have done that for you, but why shouldn't Republicans trust government unions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll say I've had some real consternation as Republicans seem to be buddying up. You've got the Teamsters speaking at the national convention, and this idea that, hey, our policies resonate with your blue collar workers, which is great, but that doesn't mean that we need to kowtow now to unions, and just a little bit afraid of kind of that populism and getting away from free markets and moving more into protectionism. But what I shared in the article is just a couple examples of where we tried to work in good faith. We tried to compromise and treated them as good faith actors, and in the end, continued to be lied to or be stabbed in the back, and just found, like I said at the very beginning, that the unions, though we may think that they're there to protect and try to help workers, from my experience, it's much more about them trying to protect their own power than it is trying to protect the workers. And we just have to realize that and be careful in that space. I gave the example in the article that I mentioned earlier around, trying to negotiate on this constitutional amendment, and then they kind of wait until we're out of session and then, completely turn their backs on them. But a big part of the story was in this bill this year and what happened. And what we found is I introduced the bill, right? It had the complete ban on collective bargaining, the other elements that we've talked about here, and sat down and continue to meet with labor unions, hear their concerns, try to find ways that we might find common ground. And that is really a Utah theme, right? We like
you call it the Utah way.
We call it the Utah way. And you've seen some great compromises in the past with religious freedom and LGBT rights, and trying to find a way that we can have a kumbaya moment where we both didn't get exactly what we wanted, but in the end, we got good policy forward, and we're better off than we were without maybe getting everything that each other wanted. And so as I was in those negotiations at the beginning of the session, one of the things I floated out there was to say, well, I understand you find value in collective bargaining. What if we went back to the certification process that I had the year before, that you had to have the 50% plus one? But in exchange for this, to get that kumbaya moment, I need all of the labor unions here within the state to come forward and go neutral on the bill and say, we're comfortable with this. We agree that it makes sense that we have a certain percentage before we go in and negotiate on behalf of all employees. And as we floated that out and we talked through it, all of the labor unions essentially agreed, all right, we will do this. In fact, I've got a letter, I don't even know where it is here, somewhere on my desk, but that is signed from the AFL-CIO and has the logos of all of the different major labor unions, where they said, all right, we agree now. If you will do these changes in the bill, you go back to the recertification, then we'll come out neutral on the bill. So we went in that direction. We prepared a substitute to the bill that did exactly that. It had passed through the House already with the complete ban. It was in the Senate. The Senate was set to pass it like that very next day. We said, let's pause on this. Let's get the language right. And what we saw was a couple things. One, you had one group of labor unions that came out and they promised it, and then over the weekend they came back after the weekend and said, well, actually, we've talked to our members and we're not sure that we can agree to this anymore. And we're like, wait a second, you're the president of this organization. Like, how can we negotiate with you if you can't actually commit your organization to something? And it was a really awkward conversation, but what it sounded like more to me was not necessarily that the members were pushing back, but it was the national groups. If you get the AFL-CIO in here, and they've said, yeah, we're neutral on this certification, they went to their national folks and they're like, what are you doing here? This is going to hurt us nationally. So even though it was good for their people in Utah, they turned their backs on their Utah people to try to kowtow to their national labor groups. So we had a couple of those with the AFL-CIO, AFSCME, AFT, that just completely committed to one thing and then reneged on that a few days later. Then we had some other groups that they said they were neutral, right? But then they refused to act like they were neutral. They would pack our galleries with their people and not tell their people that they were neutral. I had a long conversation with the Teachers Association where they said, all right, we are neutral on the bill. And I said, okay, how are you going to communicate that to teachers? Because right now, all your communication has been that you're opposed, that they need to fight this thing, that it's the worst thing that could possibly ever happen. And they said, well, we can't communicate to them that we're neutral. That would be unprecedented. And I'm like, well, you certainly can communicate that you were opposed to it. Why can't you communicate that you are neutral? And that sort of rhetoric that just went on. And it was clear to us as we looked at this as they're not really neutral. They're just trying to push this thing out, hope that it dies some other way, that they can continue to, behind the scenes, build up enough angst against the bill to either get the governor to veto it or do something else. And at that point, the Senate was just so frustrated. They're like, forget this negotiation. They are not acting in good faith. The deal here was that all of them would be neutral. They're not being neutral, and they just went and passed the bill as it was. But again, I share these messages not to say, we ran these bills as some sort of retaliation because they weren't neutral or they turned against our constitutional amendment, but just to say you can't trust these people.
Yeah.
And we need to learn that and recognize that when we come into the room with them, that these people do not have the interests of the workers at heart.
Well, it took a great deal of courage. I mean, that Senate passed, 16-13, something like that? Pretty close vote. That puts a lot of people on the union's radar when it comes time for re-election, but you'd hope that in an effort to do the right thing, these folks stuck their neck out there. So what an amazing story, and something that our federal representatives and folks in other states can learn something from. They do spend a lot of time, sometimes their entire career, trying to do deals with people like union representatives who aren't actually looking to make a deal. And as a result, nothing happens, nothing changes. That's definitely the story in Pennsylvania. And I hope we learned something from your experience there. Well, Representative Teuscher, how can we follow your work, and how can we learn more about what you're doing in Utah?
Yeah, well, I'm on Twitter. You can find me at Jordan Teuscher, TEUSCHER, as well as my website, jordanteuscher.com. But we're continuing the good fight here in Utah. Utah continues to be a leader across the country on this issue and so many others. And so love to be able to highlight the great work that we're doing here. And if you have any other ideas or great policies that we should be tackling in Utah, I'm all ears.
Okay, yeah, we do a 50-state survey on public sector labor laws that, at least at our last publishing last year, Utah received a B. And that had something to do with the amount of collective bargaining that courts seem to have allowed in Utah over the years, despite the lack of statutory authorization. Now that this bill's passed, I can't promise anything, Representative Teuscher, but I'm thinking you guys are in the A territory, if not A+. Thank you for joining us.
I hope so. And I will say, we may not be out of the woods yet, right? We have a referendum process here. They're gathering money from these national labor groups to fight against it. They have to gather 141,000 signatures in the next 30 days. So we'll see how that goes. But we feel pretty confident that the voters will stand with Utah if it gets on the ballot.
Great. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.